Chapter 9. The Harvest of Jealousy. How far we traveled during our conversation, I have not the remotest idea, but if the change aspect of the country formed any criterion of the distance, it was by no means inconsiderable. When I was at liberty to notice our surroundings, I discovered that we were passing through a district possessing as its principal feature a multitude of secluded spots and quiet retreats, but without any indication of a road to guide a stranger, and therefore an interminable labyrinth to anyone who had not a perfect knowledge of its key, but at the same time a sure asylum to the weary and hunted, who stood in need of such a haven of refuge. The atmosphere was heavy compared with that to which I had recently been accustomed. The wind, although not cold, had a chilliness not experienced before. The trees were more somber in appearance, with dark shadows lingering beneath them. The flowers had lost the brilliance and fragrance which had so impressed me at the home of rest, while the influence of the place seemed to whisper that the severity of sorrow was just taking its departure, although it was still a matter of doubt whether peace could be induced to accept the vacancy thus created. Presently my companion turned aside and bade me follow him, threading his way as he spoke, through the low-hanging branches of the trees which threatened to hide him entirely from my view, unless I quickened my pace and diligently watched the direction he took. A dozen steps behind, our track was obliterated, and I constantly wondered by what sign or power Kushna pushed so confidently forward. My attention was also attracted to a certain moisture apparently exhaled from the leaves, and which I was convinced would speedily saturate us if we had far to travel under such conditions. I was further conscious of something more than curiosity, almost alarm, as I saw the color gradually fading, first from the robes of my conductor, and then from my own, as we advanced. But as I had full employment in clearing my way, I was compelled to refrain from asking questions for the present. When we emerged from the trees, our clothing no longer possessed its delicate blue and pink tints, but had been changed to dark gray. And what surprised me equally with this was the fact of its being perfectly dry in spite of the showers of dew which had so copiously fallen upon us. As Kushna paused for me to overtake him, he smiled at my perplexity, and without waiting for me to ask, proceeded to give the explanation of such an astounding phenomenon. This, he said, is perhaps one of the most tender and beneficent provisions of our Father. Whoever come to visit or minister to one of the friends located here experience this transformation upon nearing the end of their journey. The object is to enable us to meet on apparently equal terms by preventing them from knowing the difference in our condition, and thus to enable us to give them the greater assistance, as you will soon discover in the case of Marie. The state of all at this point of development is one that requires the most careful and sympathetic treatment, and the friends employed in the mission are specifically appointed by Mayanin from among those most closely associated with himself. The condition of all those you will find here is one of repose, succeeding a period of indescribable agony, the hush of uncertainty following in the wake of the storm of hell, and the soul is indisposed to rouse itself from the dreamy numbness in which it finds its present relief from that suffering which, being scarcely over, is so vividly impressed upon its memory. Hope is not yet strong enough to counteract the fear of any exertion. Hope is not yet strong enough to counteract the fear that any exertion may result in return of the dreaded past. Confidence is not able to supplant distrust, and the only means by which they can be roused from this state of lethargy is by association with the messengers from the hills of wisdom, who inspire the feeble confidence of these needy ones by the assurance of the realization of hope that they have gained. This change in our appearance, then, is but another variation of the great law of love, I asked. Precisely so, he responded, nothing but love. Our path now lay down a gentle declivity between the hills, but before we reached the level of the valley, we turned, as if to round a clump of trees having a remarkable wealth of foliage and branches which swept the ground. On reaching the further side, however, I discovered they served to conceal the entrance to a pleasant dell in which was situated a solitary house, the first I had seen in the whole district. The little domain was a welcome retreat for one who wished to live a life of solitude. 100 safeguards having been raised, natural and unsuspicious, against intrusion, and without a trace of path or indication of any presence in the vicinity, it was almost beyond the range of possibility for a visitor to make his appearance in that peaceful dell, except those who by their knowledge of the homestead gave evidence of their interest in the welfare of its solitary resident. The garden, grounds, and general arrangement offered every inducement for the exercise and development of the mind, with abundant scope to wean the heart from sorrow in congenial and ever-varying employment. The house was not a large building, such as one would have been out of character in these surroundings, but it was exceedingly cheerful and picturesque, a mountain home, engaged for the purpose of repose and restoration, with everything provided to make one forget the past and care nothing for the future, but yet by no means a permanent habitation, being devoid of that society for which the healthy mind seeks, and chafes to find inaccessible. As we emerged from the narrow pass by which we entered, two ladies were walking leisurely across the grounds away from us, with arms affectionately entwined around each other. They looked like kindred spirits whose thoughts, too deep for words, were drawing with the well of silence a draught of refreshing sympathy. Their preoccupation gave me an opportunity of observing them before they were made aware of our presence. From the moment I beheld them, I was confident that the shorter of the two was present in the capacity of minister, or should I not use the more familiar appellation, angel, following the example of the great teacher, and laying aside her rightful state, that she might by her sacrifice be the more powerfully competent to help her unfortunate sister. The taller of the twain bore very conspicuously the evidence of weakness and weariness, and was only too glad to avail herself of the strength of her companion, so unassumingly placed at her disposal. Azina has been here almost constantly since Marie came, said Kushna as we stood watching them. I made no reply. I would rather he had not spoken, a wish my friend was quick to appreciate, and I was left undisturbed to witness a practical lesson in nursing and sympathy, which awed me with its angelic tenderness and unrestrained devotion. Such a vision of salvation needed no interpreter. My heart stood still in its sacred presence, while it made me conscious of a closer touch with God than I had ever felt before. My soul trembled with the holy tension put upon it. My feet paused in a direct refusal to cross the threshold of the temple while the fragrant incense of such a worship was ascending, and but for Krishna's interference, I should probably have yielded to my strong desire to leave that hallowed spot. But standing thus, I solved a problem in spiritual mathematics, as I solved the antithesis of life. Heaven and hell, curved by the power of love until they touched, overlapped, and blended to form the circle of divinity. In that illustration, I grasped the stupendous assurance that it will be impossible for any single soul ultimately to resist that gravitation which operates in the higher life for the purpose of lifting up the fallen or rescuing the lost. And the words of Jesus, until he find them, came to me at that moment with a force and meaning I had never seen before. There were no outward signs to indicate the extremes which were linked together by the encircling arms of those two women, but the perceptions of my soul were quickened to discern that a legion phantoms from each of the two conditions peopled that spot and wrestled with terrible vigor for the victory. The winds paused as they passed by to watch the issue of the conflict. The flowers trembled alternately with hope and fear. The trees folded their arms with statuesque stolidity, and even the grass bade its pulse stand still less in the absorption of nourishment. The movement of its expansion should give advantage to the enemy of life. Yet in this audible silence, I did not fear or doubt the issue. Why, I cannot tell, except it was that Krishna endowed me with his confidence, by which I realized that truth and love alone have an inherent immortality. Death, pain, and hell are mortal, and having once been felled, they can never rise again. The omnipotence of right surrounded and enveloped us. Its mystic influence thrilled me with its power, bidding me stand still, as influence thrilled me with as the prophet of Sinai once commanded the Israelites to stand in such a presence and see the salvation of our God. Still unconscious of our approach, their communion continued its unbroken flow, until they reached a point in the grounds where some distant object was brought within their view, the sight of which roused Marie from her reverie, prompting a degree of animation and interest which contrasted forcibly with her previous tranquillity. I was not unpleasantly affected at the change, since it broke the protracted spell which had enthralled me, and I was again anxious to be brought into closer contact and learn the story of her in whom my conductor manifested such a deep interest. I was curious, however, to know what had wrought such a change in her manner, and asked him for the explanation. From that point they obtained a magnificent view of the country, he replied, extending to the region of the hall from which we have come. This brings back to Marie a somewhat indefinite recollection of a home in which she slept her first exhaustion away, after she was induced to leave the place of her torment. The memory of that brief period between the time when she awoke and her coming here, Zena uses to inspire her hope and desire to get away and remingle in those scenes, and for that purpose they will remain as long as possible where they are. We, however, may be of equal assistance in another way, and so I think it is well to make them aware of our presence now. With this he projected a small but brilliant flash which immediately arrested their attention. Marie's face positively beamed with pleasure as she recognized who was calling her, and relinquishing her embrace of Azina, she ran towards us and greeted Kushna with all the affection of a daughter. My presence was forgotten in those first moments of reunion, not being at all necessary to their happiness, and since there is no formality of introduction demanded in this life, I joined Azina and left Kushna to make all necessary explanations, then called for me when he desired my company. I was surprised to find how free and unrestrained our intercourse was from the moment we met. Turning from our friends, we walked by mutual consent towards the point at which they were standing when Kushna called them. As we did so, I asked, "Does this place seem dull and gloomy to you in comparison with your own home?" "Dull!" she exclaimed, her face suffused with the brightness of her smile. "No, no, anything but that. Heaven consists in condition more than locality, and to have a share in driving the clouds from poor Marie's life is quite sufficient to turn any place into a heaven." I was silenced, for it was by no means difficult to conceive that heaven would always be found closely attendant upon such a companion, and I could appreciate the benefits to be derived from silent communication, such as Marie was indulging in when we first saw them. The music of her laughter would soon prove fatal to melancholy, and before the brightness of her eyes the clouds of sorrow be compelled to disappear. With the slight knowledge I possessed of the law of procedure here, I could easily understand her attendance and ministry upon Marie. It was another example of the unvarying and perfect fitness of every detail of this life to its requirement and necessity. What could be more opposite than that this poor, wounded, crushed soul, that it was occasioned by her own sin, does not alter the fact, should be entrusted in the tender and patient care of a nurse whom a painter would solicit from the gallery of dreams to sit as a model of charity. If throughout eternity heaven did no more than knit such hearts together in the close affection I had witnessed, it would, well, that would make it heaven. I am anxious to see the view which Kushna tells me may be had from the bottom of the grounds, I remarked presently. Yes, you must see that, she replied. It is just like that dear old Dr. Grandpa to find this place for Marie. I don't think that he has much of an appearance of a grandfather, I said, though every inch of him is a doctor. Yet there was something about him, in spite of his youthful visage, which told me that dual epithet was the most comprehensive and correct one which could be applied to him. He had been an unsolved enigma from the moment I first met him, and the idea of obtaining a further insight into the character which had so perplexed me was a very welcome one. No, she responded, he scarcely looks old enough, does he? But that is by no means due to his lack of years. It must rather be ascribed to the eternal youth we enjoy. When he came into this life, he was both a grandpa and a doctor, and though he has grown so very youthful in his form and bearing, we are compelled to give him his double cognomen, or we should only refer to half of what he is even now. Has he been here long? Yes, he lived in the early days of Egypt. I think it was prior to the building of the pyramids. And does he remember his earth life? I do not think he has forgotten a single incident, either in his earth or present life, if he will give himself a moment to recall it. One of the things which makes him like a grandpa still is the delight he finds in gathering a number of us together and recounting episodes from his own experience for our instruction and amusement. He is, I think, the most unselfish man I ever met, having no thought for himself, but only existing to augment the happiness of everyone with whom he comes in contact, always planning new pleasures and surprises. When he introduces them, he does it in a kind of apologetic tone, as though he had committed some offense, and was about to ask for pardon. And when he sees the additional happiness invariably resulting from his labors, he himself is quite happy, first in sympathy with those whom he has made so glad, and then again that he has been the means of such enjoyment. Why, now, let me tell you how it is that Marie is here. He met her first on the other side of the mists. Has he told you? Yes, he told me how and where he met her. But has he not told you how long and difficult was his work before he could induce her to listen to him? Of the conflict he had with malignant spirits who delighted in her torture and tried to frustrate all his endeavors? You know nothing of his many failures to make her come away from such horrible surroundings, if only for a space to prove that no one but herself stood in the way of her peace, since the legitimate penalty of her sin had been paid. No one but himself knows the extent of this, and no one ever will, for it is buried with a thousand similar secrets in the oblivion of his own breast, never to be willingly recalled or thought of again. I have heard something of this from Marie, but poor child, her memory of that period is happily overcast, though she has told me enough to show the struggle was a fierce one, and the reward of it will, by and by, be not the least of bright jewels which will sparkle in his diadem. When at length he accomplished his object, he gained permission to carry her to his home, where he could watch her as she slept through the prostration that succeeded her suffering, and while she slept he could scarcely be persuaded to leave her side, lest even in her sleep she should feel his absence and be lonely. Such devotion had its reward, and was powerful in removing much of her weight of trouble. His determination to make her happy won her confidence first, then her love, and finally was the means of enabling him to be the minister of her salvation. It is very pathetic to hear Marie speak of her waking, and Kushna's tender but compulsory announcement that he would take her to her own home, where she would be better for a time than ever where she was. She was full of fear that if he left her, she would be drawn back to the agony of the past, and pleaded long and tearfully to be allowed to stay. That could not be, so he did the next best thing to it. Knowing she must be located here for a time, he searched the district until he found this house, which affords from this point of view, of which he spoke. This lovely valley is an incessant theme of admiration for her, and on the hillside, in the far away, but yet distinctly visible in the glory light which plays upon it, stands Kushna's house, her other home, as she always calls it, and she delights to stand here talking of him and watching for his coming, as he generally does, straight across. The beautiful panorama unrolled before me the circumstances we were discussing, and the close proximity of the two of the chief actors in this thrilling drama filled me too full for speech. I could only contemplate how each succeeding incident in my career bore ever stronger testimony to that law of love which is the mainspring of this life. At the time Kushna called us, she continued after a moment's pause, we were looking at this home, which Marie considers the central feature of the landscape, and she was wondering, how long do you intend to keep her waiting? We turned to find Kushna had stolen upon us unobserved. How much of our conversation had been heard we had no idea, but his next sentence told us that he well knew what its drift had been. Azina, he said, I'm sadly afraid that you are a little telltale, and I shall be compelled to administer some correction to you. You are a good dear old grandpa, and deserve to be kissed for listening. There, there, she cried as she threw her arms around him and saluted him on either cheek. Oh, these children, he replied, as he shook his head at her in mock gravity. And then turning to me, he said, I think you had better go and keep Marie company while I give this child a scold. Why, you dear old darling, you would not know how to begin if you tried, were the last words I heard as I turned away. I was glad to be able to hear Marie's story from her own lips, but as I neared her and saw her face darkened by the shadow of some approaching agony, so changed from its brightness as she greeted Kushna, I would have gladly forgone the recital, if by that means I could have witnessed the return of her former happiness. But again I was impelled by that mysterious influence which operates to carry us over points of difficulty and uncertainty, always in the right direction. even though opposed to inclination and understanding for the time being. In spite of the consequences, I knew it was best to go forward and leave to Kushna's future explanation whatever might transpire of an incomprehensible nature. I had already learned so much of the development of blessings from the most apparent improbabilities as to feel confident that all things work together for good, and began to watch for the manifestation of all kinds of surprises in every new feature of the life as it was presented to me. As Marie came towards me, I was conscious of the effort she exerted to overcome the premonition which so visibly enveloped her, and the unsuccessful attempt she made to greet me with a smile which died in its birth throb. But I knew that my face only too faithfully represented my feelings at the moment, so our interview commenced with a greeting signally ominous of its tragic termination. Kushna had made all necessary explanations as to the object of my visit, and so, with very few preliminaries, Marie proceeded to give me her experiences as follows.